Hey guys, Ben here with Oddly Armed, and today we're finally getting into PCCs and starting it out in the oddest way possible with an FN PS90, one of the coolest pop culture SMGs out there. So let's go ahead and talk about the history of the PS90 and where it comes from. The history of the P90 goes back to 1986 when NATO requested a replacement for all the 9mm in their various countries at the time. So they were looking for both a shoulder-fired weapon as well as a pistol to replace the 9mm. So the question comes up, what was wrong with 9mm at the time? And the main thing that was a concern for them was the proliferation of body armor in the Soviet Union was starting to take off at that point. So wasn't the body armor that we're expecting to see on the battlefield today. So we have level 4 ceramic or some of the high-strength polyurethane plates nowadays. Back then, they were looking at soft body armor or maybe some lightweight titanium body armor, which was meant to stop just standard ball pistol rounds. And that was a concern, particularly for rear echelon troops. So we're talking our logistics people, intel people back at headquarters, who would potentially, in the event of an invasion of the Soviet Union into Eastern Europe, be looking at paratroopers, Soviet paratroopers, dropping in where they're at, and they wouldn't necessarily want to have a full rifle with them due to the specific nature of their job. They wouldn't be wanting to carry around, say, an M16 everywhere that they went. They want something lighter, more compact, where they're really not going to be using it for a combat. It's more of a defensive weapon. And that's where we get the term personal defense weapon, or PDW, from. Now, talking about PDWs, it's kind of a nebulous term because it could be really satisfied by a whole lot of different things. So for example, you can have a 545 PDW, so the AKS-74U really fit into that category, or you could have the 5.7 with the P90. The MP5K can be considered a PDW depending on how you really view the term. And going back to World War I, they even had PDWs back then, or at least what we would consider now to be a PDW, with the C96 as well as the Luger, which utilized a shoulder stock and equipped like artillery troops who weren't expecting to see frontline combat. However, they still had to be armed with something just in case it came up. Another really famous example of something which could be considered a PDW is the M1 carbine in World War II, which was originally designed primarily for NCOs and officers who had a lot of other things to worry about in combat, so they didn't want to be carrying a heavy M1 Garand. They need to be moving around and really doing command and control things versus actually fighting. And then the M1 carbine also equipped a lot of your rear echelon troops again, so your cooks, again, all the logistics people who really didn't want to be carrying around that heavy M1 Garand. Now, getting back to the P90 itself, after a couple of different really interesting prototype weapons, what FN finally finalized on in 1990 was what we know and love today as the P90. Now, looking at it, it is a very interesting rifle as far as its form goes. So this is a bullpup submachine gun with about a 10.4-inch barrel. And then the most famous thing about this gun probably is going to be that magazine which sits on top of the submachine gun that carries a whole 50 rounds of ammunition. P90 was also designed to be incredibly compact. In this form here with its 10.4-inch barrel, it comes in at just under 20 inches long. And that was part of the design philosophy because they wanted it to be about the width of a man's shoulders. So say if you're doing vehicle ops, if you're in a convoy or something like that and you need to jump out of a vehicle, this thing is not going to get in your way at all. Arguably, the most important part of the P90 though is its ammunition, that 5.7 by 28mm round that FN developed for it. So again, it's meant to defeat body armor, particularly soft body armor, so like your level 3 stuff. And the number one thing that defeats body armor is velocity. So the 5.7 round, if you take a look at it, it's very interesting. It's almost like a mini 5.56, so it has a bottleneck, has a lot of case capacity when compared to the very, very small lightweight, usually around 40 grain or less bullet that it utilizes. And it's able to push those rounds up to over 2,300 feet per second, which is very, very fast for a pistol round. And the really famous cartridge for this gun is the SS-190, and that utilized a aluminum core and steel penetrator in that round. In the US, that ammunition for civilians is very hard to get your hands on and expensive due to laws which limit the sale of armor-piercing pistol rounds to civilians. It's not necessarily illegal to own, but it's illegal to sell to people. The other really cool part of the P90 is the magazine design, which is very, very unique to this rifle, and it basically uses a slide in the rear of the magazine to turn the cartridges sideways, so they're going perpendicular to the barrel of the gun, stacking all the way forward, and you get a 50-round magazine in a form which doesn't stick off of the gun at all. So it's very, very cool, very interesting and novel design. One thing I see actually get brought up a lot is converting a P90 to like 5.56 or 9mm. The 5.7 cartridge was actually designed specifically to work with this magazine, with that slide and being able to stack sideways. One of the ways it does that is it has a straight sidewall to the cartridge, which most cartridges nowadays have a taper to them because that actually enhances reliability. And that's an issue with the 5.7 because it actually needs to have a polymer or a oil coating on it to be able to extract well in pretty much any P90 or 5.7 pistol. Following the collapse of the Soviet Union, that original requirement to be able to defeat body armor was not really necessary for NATO anymore. So the P90 didn't get tested until around 2002 and 2003 when they finally got around to it. At this point though, the P90 was no longer the only name in the game because Heckler & Koch had the MP7, which is chambered in the 4.6 by 30mm round. So these trials in 2002 and 2003, while they were testing the weapon, the most important part for the trials was actually the ammunition. So that was the 5.7 versus the 4.6. And after doing a ton of testing with it, determining how it performed in terminal ballistics and how much wounding capability it actually had, they determined that the 5.7 was actually quite a bit more capable than the 4.6. So at that point you would think, all right, trials are done, the P90 wins it, it's got the cartridge we want, it's effective, it's a good weapon system, but Germany kind of got in the way of it because they wanted the MP7 to be adopted, so they essentially blocked the proceedings to where it just died. There was no PDW that was decided on by NATO. One other thing that you always have to talk about when talking about the P90 is its companion weapon, the FN 5.7. So again, the original requirement from NATO was they wanted both a shoulder-fired weapon, the P90, as well as a handgun chambered in that PDW cartridge. So this is what FN developed to use that 5.7mm round. It is a very, very nice handgun, good shooter, with about a third as much recoil as most 9mm handguns. Now, Heckler & Koch with the MP7 also worked to develop their own 4.6 by 30mm handgun as well, which was known as a UCP. However, that never left the prototype stage versus the 5.7, which is now in its third generation. Despite not being adopted by NATO in the early 2000s, the P90 has actually been adopted by quite a few different NATO countries. So you have Austria, you have Belgium, a couple of other different ones, Netherlands. And it's been primarily adopted for usage by counterterrorism forces or special forces who can use a very small weapon like this. Potentially they might be doing personal protection detail for dignitaries, stuff like that, where they need something which is small and concealable, but still packs enough firepower to be useful. One of the most famous adopters of the P90 was actually the US Secret Service, who have been using these things for years now. And you'll see them pop up every once in a while in a picture, but again, they're not going to be super out there with the information on the weapons that they're using. And I've heard some rumors that they're no longer utilizing the P90, but I haven't really seen anything official to confirm that. And in 2021, NATO finally got around to standardizing on the 5.7mm cartridge. Now, what that actually means for it is still to be seen. I don't think we're going to see widespread replacement of 9mm in NATO service. However, it is cool to see that cartridge next to the 7.62x51 and 5.56x45 in NATO standardized cartridges. When it comes to US civilian sales, the PS90 has been on the market since about 2005, so it is very well established and has been here for a long time. And over the years, it's come in a couple of different forms. So you have the original one, which had the USG sight, which is a ring sight. This is a very, very interesting integrated sight for this weapon system that utilizes a black ring as well as tritium to illuminate the sight at night. but those were sold fairly early on, as well as what were known as white ring sights, which utilized a similar sight, however it used a polymer housing instead of the aluminum one, and a white ring on it, which again, pretty interesting, not the greatest sight in the world. And since then, there's also been the tri-rail model, which replaced this entire upper assembly with a rail instead, so you're easily able to mount optics. And that really only lasted for a few years before the PS90 standard model came out, which essentially added a iron sight kind of Picatinny rail. It's a very weird design that sets the rail up very high on the receiver, gives you very high height over bore, and to be honest, the best use for that particular rail is removing it and replacing it with something else. And that's going to do it for the history on the P90 and the PS90. So let's go ahead and get into our ratings. And real quick, I want to give a big shout out to the Echo Valley Training Center in Cape on Hill, West Virginia, where I've taken this rifle out a lot and had some buddies mess around with it. So please, if you're in the DC area, check them out. First up is accuracy, where I'm going to be giving the P90 a 3. At 25 yards using 40 grain Fiocchi ammunition, I was able to get a 5.2 MOA group with this. Now, PCCs in general are going to be a lot less accurate than rifles. However, with the P90, it also has a barrel which is essentially floating in the receiver, so it's not necessarily going to be the most accurate gun in the world. On the bright side, that 5.7 ammunition is going to actually hold its trajectory a lot flatter than a 9mm or a pistol cartridge, so this will actually do better at longer ranges than most PCCs. Next up, we have Aftermarket, where I'm going to be giving the PS90 a 4, because there's actually quite a bit that you can get for this rifle. Now, some of the companies making parts, first up, we're going to be talking about HB Industries, HBI. They make different optics mounts, so again, that original rail that comes on the PS90 it's garbage, it's total crap. So you want to replace that with something which can directly mount a red dot, and there are multiple different companies that build those different mounting interfaces. So HBI does that. Titan Tactical and Haga Defense, I believe, also make different optics mounts for this. Now, the charging handle is another thing which is very, very small on the original P90 just because they want it to be super compact. So again, there's going to be multiple companies making extended charging handles for it. So again, HBI, Titan Tactical, I believe, Haga Defense all make different charging handles for it. There's other companies, Parker Mountain Machine, I believe, also makes charging handles. So there are options out there to replace those. Now, another thing is mounting slings on the P90 is actually very difficult just due to the way it's designed. There's been a couple of different ways it's been done over the years. Urban ERT actually makes a harness that goes around the stock of this, which allows you to use a sling. But then you also have a bunch of the same companies, so HBI, Titan Tactical, all those ones I keep mentioning. PMM is another one that replaces some of the screws that hold together the receiver here with essentially QD mounts, so that you can actually get a sling to mount at different positions along the rifle depending on what you're looking for. Now, as far as lights and other accessories go, on the original receiver there are mounting points for side rails on it, so you can add Picatinny rails to either side of this big square part of the receiver here. So you can just do it that way. Different companies also make like M-Lock adapters for that, or Scout Light, Surefire Scout Light adapters for it. So there are options to direct mount different lights and other accessories to the rifle. Of course, I have my Streamlight RM1 on here, so that's just mounted to the Picatinny rail. Now, some other companies making parts, one of the biggest ones, and what I have in here, is going to be CMMG. They produce a replacement barrel with the original 10.4 inch length. So if you do SBR your original PS90 with that 16 inch barrel, the CMMG barrel is very high quality, and they also make different flash hiders, and then they also make a 1/2x28 thread adapter for it as well. So that is an option there to SBR this. Imperial Arms is another company that comes up because they build the XF50 receiver for these. Now, the serialized portion of the P90 is the upper receiver, or the aluminum portion here, so that is considered a firearm by itself. Another option for optics, which is going to be very hard to come by nowadays, and they only come in drips and drabs for some reason, are these ring sights. So these are the original optics that came with the P90 way back when they first started. and they're really cool optics. There are different models. Mine is the electronic model, so it has an green illuminated reticle in there. But these don't really come in all that often, and they actually command quite a premium when they're no longer being imported. Next up, we have durability, where I'm given the PS90A3. So as far as construction goes, the polymer stock is very well made, and it's held up to me pretty well. You can scratch it if you like lean it up against rocks and stuff. I have done that with it, but I'm not super concerned about the polymer. For the receiver itself, it is made out of aluminum. I believe it's a cast aluminum part, so the finishing on it is a little bit on the rough side. You can see machining marks. From the casting, it has a bit of a pebble texture to it, but I'm not too worried about it breaking down over time. And the finish, it has worn away a little bit in places, but overall I'm not super concerned about that. It is a little bit on the rougher side though. Now, where I'm definitely going to be dropping off points is the magazines. Due to the way that the magazines work, they actually have a separate component in the back of the magazine to actually do the slide, the ramp that turns the cartridges sideways. I've had one magazine where that ramp failed and basically just fell out the bottom of the magazine. I did try to replace it and glue it back in there. However, it is no longer a reliable magazine and jams all the time. So if your magazine fails in that part, it's pretty much done. Next up, we have ergonomics, where I'm going to give the PS90A3. All right, so starting out with controls here, up front, the main thing that we got are the charging handles. So that's going to be it's going to be ambidextrous on both sides. So we have these little nub charging handles on the left, and then on the right side of the rifle. They are tiny, so you kind of got to get a finger around them to pull it back there. That is actually probably good they're this small, because it's meant to be super, super compact to the rifle. But again, you can replace it if you want something that's a little bit more reachable. They are non-reciprocating though, so that is definitely nice. Now moving on to the safety selector, it's going to be this little disc right here underneath the trigger. It's just safe semi. You can flick it with your finger. It is ambidextrous, so you have that little nub, that little cutout on both sides. On the P90, for the full auto one, it is 3 different positions, so you do have an auto position. However, that also has a progressive trigger. So you pull the trigger back halfway and you get a single shot. You pull it back all the way and it goes full auto. Now moving back to the magazine release, it is these little, I guess, levers here at the back of the receiver. So you just have to pull back on those and then grab the magazine and pull it up. So very different compared to anything else out there, but then you can just pull the magazine right out the back of the receiver there, and you can see that gigantic window. Now, here I can actually demonstrate one more thing for you. So that's your bolt here. So pretty simple. As you can see, it ejects straight through there, so you can see all the way through. However, if you look in the bottom here, there's a dust cover in here. So you can see that, and that clicks close right there. Now, another thing that you can do with that is if you hold your bolt open and then you lift that up, a little awkward to demonstrate here, it actually has a little ledge there which holds the bolt back. So this way, if you need to keep the bolt held open, you can do it using that dust cover. And then to release it, you just pull back, release it, and it'll send it home. Now, reinserting your magazine, again, is going to be very different on this. You just have that window there, so you go ahead and place it in the window. And then you just essentially hit it. You just knock it in place and it'll go ahead and lock in there. And that's about all we have to go over for that. I will go over real quick the pistol grip here. So you can see it is very different compared to anything else. You have a foregrip and then a very steeply angled thumb hole stock here. So the way this foregrip is meant to work, you can see it's a very large trigger, or a trigger guard here essentially. And the way it's meant to work is you can stick your thumb in there and then grip it like that. However, I don't like doing that. I have, for one thing, gigantic thumbs, so it kind of gets in the way. And I actually prefer to keep my thumb on the outside and just place it along the receiver here. That's very comfortable for me, but that is an option if you want to run it like that. When it comes to maintenance, I'm going to give it the PS90A4. As far as disassembly goes, it could not be simpler than it is on this gun. So you basically pop out the magazine, there's a giant button you hit, and the receiver comes off the stock. Your bolt just pops right out, and then you can take off the butt plate and take out your trigger group. So at that point, you have basically 5 major components plus a magazine. and it's very easy to maintain. You have great access to your chamber. You can clean the bolt carrier or the bolt off very easily. And that's actually really good because this is a straight blowback firearm, and straight blowback firearms are always going to be fairly dirty when they run. So it will get pretty filthy in there, but it's easy enough to clean off. And as far as getting replacement parts for this, it's actually fairly easy to do. Midwest Gunworks is probably the best place I found that carries OEM parts for the P90. And it seems like they're generally in stock. So if you need a firing pin, if you need a return spring, something like that to replace what you, something that broke on the rifle, it's pretty easy to get and replace those parts. Now, in terms of modularity, I'm going to give the P90 a 3. So there are some things that you can change out on here. The biggest ones are going to be optics. So again, with this receiver design, you have a bunch of different optic mount options. So you can direct mount acros, AEMS, aimpoint T1s or whatever. There are quite a few options. Again, this ring sight I have on here is one of my favorite ones, but you can swap that around. And then there are options on adding M-LOK to the side of the receiver. With a gun this compact, there's not a whole lot you can do to change it though, because the stock is essentially what it is. You're not going to be changing out like the pistol grip, stuff like that are going to be the way the rifle is from the factory. In terms of price, the PS90 is just barely going to eke out a 4, coming in at a little bit under $1,500 from a couple of different places right now. So definitely not the cheapest one out there, but it could be more expensive, and it has been in the past. Now, as far as ammunition costs go for the 5.7 round, it's come down a lot over the last few years. So a lot of that I'm going to give to the proliferation of different 5.7 guns. So you have Ruger with their 5.7 pistol, and then you also have Kel-Tec coming out with multiple 5.7 guns, and Smith & Wesson, which has really brought down the cost of 5.7 because it used to be close to $1 a round, particularly during COVID, and it's down to about 17 bucks for a box of 50. And next up we have shooting characteristics, where I'm going to give the PS90 a 4. Now, as far as the trigger goes, this is a bullpup, so it's going to be a little bit rough. As far as the weight, it's actually not bad, coming in at about 6 pounds for the trigger pull. However, it is plastic on plastic in there, so you're going to get some creep. It's going to feel very plasticky. So it is a bullpup trigger at the end of the day. Now, as far as recoil impulse goes, the 5.7 round was specifically designed to have a lower recoil than 9mm by about 1/3. So this is a very light recoiling rifle. And it's an absolute pleasure to shoot. You can shoot it very quickly without any issues, even though it is straight blowback. Now, as far as suppressing the PS90 goes, it is a little bit complicated in some ways because your can selection is going to vary depending on what caliber can it is. So your standard 9mm cans are generally not going to be rated for 5.7 because it is a higher velocity, higher pressure round. But your 22 cans, there's a lot of 22 cans that will actually work with 5.7. But usually I actually just use a rifle can. So I use this with either my Saker 7.62 for my full back pressure can. With the full back pressure can, this does get a little bit gassy. The recoil is still not bad at all. The bolt's definitely moving a little bit quicker. You get a little bit of gas, and then with the B&T SRBS 7.62 I have, that's going to be a low back pressure can, and it's very pleasant to shoot with that can. And overall, it's actually quite quiet too. For some reason, even though the round's going supersonic, it's not one of the louder guns I own. In terms of reliability, I'm gonna give the PS90 a 4. For the most part, as long as you're using good ammunition, this thing is gonna run like a top. Now, one of the considerations with the 5.7 round is it has those straight sidewalls on it. So extraction is actually a bit more difficult than it is with something like a 9mm or a 5.56, where there's actually a very slight taper to it. And because of that, they actually had to design a polymer coating for the casing so that it could reliably extract from the P90. Now, some aftermarket rounds, the biggest one being American Eagle, don't necessarily have that coating on it, and without that coating, you can run into reliability issues with that. So American Eagle, I do every once in a while have a malfunction with my P90, but for the most part it's reliable. So stuff like Fiocchi though, that does have that lining on it. And then the PSA ammunition, their new 5.7, is actually really interesting because it's an oily texture, like a dark oily substance on the outside of the case that they use to lube it. So very, very interesting. If you ever look at their ammunition, it's pretty unique. Moving on to weight, PS90 is going to get a 4, weighing in at about 5.8 pounds. So it's not the heaviest PCC out there, but it's also not incredibly lightweight. And when we add up all 10 categories for the PS90, we come out with an overall score of 37, which is going to throw it up into the A tier. Now, some of the high points for the P90 are going to be its aftermarket support is actually pretty prevalent. It also has pretty good ease of maintenance. The disassembly on it is incredibly easy, and it's very easy to clean, and it's very, very low recoil due to that 5.7 round. Now, on the downsides for the PS90, the ergonomics are unique and take a little bit of getting used to. They're not bad when you get used to it, but it's definitely different. And then it's also going to be a little bit weird when it comes to durability due to the magazine quality on it. But other than that, it's a fantastic gun. And finally, when it comes to the cool tier for the PS90, I mean, it's got to be S tier. There's no question about it. This thing is 100% going up in the S tier. So talking about films and media, we absolutely have to hit on Stargate. So this was the main thing that popped up in Stargate SG-1. Everyone knows the P90 from Stargate and was very prevalent in there. And that's where people really got their first taste of this gun. Now, past that, it's been in a lot of other movies and TV shows as well. One that I personally remember from back in the day when I was growing up was The World Is Not Enough, James Bond movie. This was one of the very prevalent weapons in that. And I really can't even begin to name all of the movies that this was in, because if you need a really cool, interesting looking gun, the P90 is one of the best ones out there for it. I mean, it's been in White House Down, a bunch of different Underworld movies, Bad Boys, it's been in the Hunger Games movies. This thing is all over the place in media. When it comes to video games, it's more difficult to find one that doesn't have the P90 than does, because this thing is, again, going to be all over the place, going back all the way to GoldenEye 007 back in the 1990s, to Call of Duty games all the way from Modern Warfare to today, Battlefield games all the way up through more recent ones. And then also like Far Cry games, Rainbow Six. This thing is all over the place. If you're going to have modern weapons in there, there's going to be a P90 in the arsenal. Alright guys, so that's going to do it for my review on the FN PS90. So thank you for checking out this video. Please like, share, subscribe, and I will have more stuff coming on down the line.